When you hear the words Super Nintendo and Squaresoft, what comes to mind? Final Fantasy, Chrono Trigger, Super Mario RPG, for some of ya, maybe the US release of Breath of Fire. During this era of video games, Square was on top. And the game that always struck me from a distance was Secret of Mana. It was one of those cool little RPGs, but with multiplayer. It was this massive adventure that began pretty quickly out of the gate with the player being exiled from their hometown. It was also hard as hell for a 4 or 5-year-old. The type of difficulty where your impatient child brain's too small to understand that you have to wait before mashing the button. Why won't it work? Secret of Mana got a ton of critical praise. It was beautiful to look at. It had a top-tier soundtrack, mascot-tier enemies all over the place, and well, it's just a good-ass game. Especially now that I'm not a child and understand patience. So what was next for Secret of Mana? Well, things are kind of weird. If we look at this strictly as a Western audience, it would be a little game called Secret of Evermore, a North American-made sequel to Mana using the same engine, same style, same everything, really. A game starring a boy and his dog who are teleported to the world of Evermore, I guess. As far as I knew, this was what was next. I actually played this one a bit as a kid and it scared the crap out of me. When you're 6 years old, you don't look at the game credits and you're not aware of the westernization of an entire game franchise. As many of you probably know, the Mana series is known in Japan as Seiken Densetsu, a series whose original title came to the States as Final Fantasy Adventure, or in Japan, Seiken Densetsu Final Fantasy Gaiden. It's a series whose first installment was created as a spin-off rather than the start to its own decade-spanning franchise. One that would be remade 2 different times with 2 different names. Sword of Mana in 2003 and Adventure of Mana in 2016. And all 3 of these are just okay. So if you weren't a cool gamer devouring cool gamer facts on the internet, the Mana series looked like Secret of Mana, Secret of Evermore, and then the main topic of today's video, the 1999 PlayStation 1 exclusive Legend of Mana. A game that, despite being showcased as the next big Mana game, was extremely avant-garde, and probably most weird, a rare 2D game in the 3D dominated landscape of gaming. You weren't expecting Square to put out 2D back then.
So yo, it's Austin, and today we're going to be talking about the black sheep of the Mana franchise, Legend of Mana. This one's a long-awaited Patreon request by Brandon Howe, so thank you very much for the suggestion and thank you so much for your patience. This is one of those games whose place in history is just as interesting as the game itself, so we've got a lot to cover here, and let's get started.
But let's not forget about Route B. What if you were one of those cool gamers who knew cool things like the correct Final Fantasy numbers or Super Mario 2? Then it's highly likely you knew Secret of Evermore, while extremely unique, wasn't a real Seiken game. You might have also played, in my personal opinion, the best Mana game, Seiken Densetsu 3, now known as Trials of Mana. Back in the day on my gateway computer that could barely run ZNES, I was all about playing various fan-translated video games for the plethora of JRPGs that wouldn't get an English release. This is a topic I'm going to come back to someday, but among the never-ending list of RPGs like Bahamut Lagoon, Mother 3, Final Fantasy V, and the dope Sailor Moon RPG was Seiken Densetsu 3. By all means, in terms of gameplay, style, and the stunning visuals packed from start to finish, this felt like the natural follow-up to Secret of Mana. You picked 3 of 6 characters to play as, each potentially following one of 3 story routes for one of 3 different endings. These little sprites were packed with so much detail, yet they didn't stick out like a sore thumb. The music, once again, killer. It's just a super good game. This would eventually come out officially in 2019 alongside its own modern 3D remake that unfortunately cursed us with Charlotte speak, but at least it made it.
I grew up with no parents, but there was one poised in window that was always nice to me.
So, if you look at Legend of Mana as the 4th game in a series with a history of pretty darn good games behind it, how does it fare? If you were expecting another solid action RPG with a cohesive narrative, deep characters, and beautiful aesthetics, you'd be about half right. Series creator Koichi Ishii has gone on record stating that he wanted Seiken Densetsu to be a fictional world as opposed to a singular creation. Something of a serialized fantasy concept that can be explored through all sorts of video games. Kinda like a J.R. Tolkien's Middle-earth or the ever-evolving Ivalice seen in Final Fantasy Tactics, 12, 14, and Vagrant Story. That's not a crazy concept or anything, but it becomes confusing when you realize that Legend of Mana isn't called Seiken Densetsu 4 in Japan. Now, that goes to a PlayStation 2 game called Dawn of Mana that came out 7 years later, making Legend and 2 other games spin-offs technically. Basically what I'm saying is that the timeline is real freaking confusing, but thankfully you don't need any of it. I realize this sounds like a devastatingly long intro for a simple PlayStation 1 game, but I think the context for what Legend is in the grand scheme of everything is very important. And that's because many, myself included, considered Legend of Mana the crossroads for the Seiken Densetsu franchise. Late 90s and early 2000s, Square loved to get freaky with what they were doing. I'd like to think that this is where Unlimited Saga, the Bouncer, Driving Emotion Type S, and Bushido Blade come from. And Tobal, never forget Tobal. But starting with Legend of Mana, the entire Mana franchise became this weird experimental thing filled with mobile card games, dungeon crawlers, real-time strategy games, and of course, action RPGs. Unfortunately, just like the genre selection, the quality also seems to be all over the place.
For a lot of people, Legend of Mana is unfortunately considered on that side, but I'm here to tell you why I think it's a brilliant, underrated classic. One good enough to get itself an HD remaster announced while I was in the middle of making this video, so good job me. As a kid, I certainly had zero complaints the second I put in the disc.
Beautiful. In these PlayStation 1 days, any good RPG had itself an opening FMV with a catchy track, and Legend of Mana did not disappoint. In fact, Yoko Shimomura took over music for this game, you know the one. And for the intro track, Song of Mana teamed up with Swedish singer Annika Lundberg, I hope I'm saying that correctly, to create this unlikely orchestral folk song that creates a striking atmosphere right out of the gate. Also, I found out that Annika was this Annika. That's what you call cursed knowledge.
It wasn't until yesterday that I realized that that was sung in Swedish and not a made-up language. Sorry, sweet friends.
The intro cutscene shows us a bunch of characters such as Dana and Lark, but this game's not gonna play out quite like you think. New Game brings us to a menu where you pick a character to play as and a weapon type to start with. Then after naming my character, I'm shown this map, and I thought the game froze because it didn't show me any button prompts. Whoops. From here, you select a play area, and it becomes quickly evident that yes, this is a very different type of game from the previous Mana titles. For what it's worth, Legend of Mana is about as close to a choose-your-own-adventure video game you could get on a console from this era. Throughout the game, you obtain little artifacts that you place down in order to create areas, which, for the beginning, is your home, a cozy little treehouse. That is, after you stare at the map screen for a minute, baffled as to where to begin. So you walk into your house, get acquainted with the controls, take in all the beautiful hand-drawn backgrounds as you do, and then a little leafy man comes up, gives you another artifact in order to find a little town called Domina. He goes on a little spiel that is very central to the main theme of this game, which is easily missable if you're mashing through, but essentially, Legend of Mana plays out like this. You explore an area, potentially fight some stuff, you'll find little events and quests that you can do that have little bits of story. These can be simple, like helping find a lost princess, or much more involved, like trying to regain your humanity by serving an evil dragon. You know, video game stuff. There's a ton of NPCs who can join your party to help with quests and temporarily recruit. There's over 60 main events in this game that have little episodes of narrative and story here and there. The main issue that a lot of people have with Legend of Mana though is that it is all so convoluted. There's not an indicator of what you're supposed to be doing at any point. It's entirely possible to end up with a ton of unfinished events clogging up your quest log just because you have a hard time figuring out where you need to go for certain events. There's an in-game encyclopedia that gives information on monsters and characters, but that'll only help so much. But at the same time, the immersion created by forcing the player to explore every nook and cranny is top tier. The world of Fadiel is completely shaped by the imagination of the player. As you're supposed to be imagining where places are, you get to literally create the map as you collect artifacts from the quests you do and the people you meet. You play the role of a silent protagonist going around helping everyone they meet, even if they're fairies. Fairies are dicks. like all of them. Legend of Mana does not have a central focused narrative. There's no grand quest to follow, no twists and turns to navigate. If anything, this game does its best to make a point to highlight the petty squabbles of humanity. In the intro text, the series' constant mana tree speaks to the player of how it feels unnecessary in the world and that they should be reminded of its existence and power. It's an allegory for technology and how the legends of the past are irrelevant to the society of today, a coming-of-age tale for the middle age. Kind of. It's about being washed up. So initially, instead of worrying about a big baddie who killed your family and wants to eat your soul, you'll be doing a little bit here and there in each of the 25 areas in the game. Some of which are these incredibly cozy towns and villages, but most are the combat mazes and dungeons. Then you too can wander off into a forest and get stun locked by vegetables. God, look at those beautiful trees.
For now, let's move on to one of the more historically important aspects of any of the Mana games, the gameplay and combat. Secret of Mana gave us a Square quality world, but it also gave us a really interesting action combat system that they hadn't really been famous for. It's something that had been done before, but not quite to that visual level. So how does Legend of Mana play?
Legend of Mana's combat system is really weird. It's not a top-down action romp like Trials or Secret. It's not a side-scrolling beat-em-up like Dragon Valor or Streets of Rage. There's no attack percentages on the screen like its predecessors. Combat in Legend varies greatly depending on your choice of weapon. You can hit them with the standard 3-hit combo while wielding a two-hander, or you can go all fast and furious with some nunchucks. Each weapon type has bigger abilities you can use that consume an ability meter. You can also create musical instruments that give you chargeable spells that you can use anytime. Crafting is a whole ordeal that I don't really need to get into, but this game lets you grind a lot of weapons and items and stuff for your pets if you want. Yeah, there's pets. Everything kind of follows the theme of go grind an item and then put it into this thing to make it stronger, be it an animal or a pot or a golem technology Tetris puzzle thing. It's all totally optional content, only really there for people who really want to min-max. But then of course, with the obviously cryptic and exploratory nature of this game comes face button abilities that unlock through invisible numbers. So every weapon has a heavy and light attack on square cross, but you also get a bunch of abilities that you can put on the triggers and a bunch of miscellaneous abilities you can put on triangle and circle. These can be as simple as jump, defend, spin, crouch, but you need to combine their usage in order to unlock new abilities that you can use. These can then be combined with your standard 3-button attacks and your individual abilities that are all weapon based to get some good combos, although it's gonna take some practice. My favorite to use was a normal 3-hit combo followed by a high jump heavy into a flip kick which does a little damage on the way out, which sounds ridiculous when I say that out loud. There's a ton of different abilities you can combine in order to have a bit more control over yourself in combat. It's pretty fun, if a bit overwhelming to learn. Top this with the individual ability skills, extremely obfuscated level design, very in-depth crafting systems, pet raising, and whatever the heck we're looking at here, and there's clearly a theme this game's going for.
I like Legend of Mana quite a bit, but do yourself a favor, use a walkthrough. It may not lead to the most organic playthrough of all the events, but some of the elements are just as baffling to new players today as they were back then. Mana's really fun when you're playing it, but sitting around crunching numbers and just trying to figure out what the hell's going on is not.
I mean, hell, the location of where you place the artifacts on the map in relation to your starting point has a huge effect on different elements of the game, even potentially locking you out of specific events. Not that any of this is told to you at all. Certain areas need to have specific elemental mana balances in order to unlock things, and to be honest, I still don't understand it at all. If anything, just follow a guide on map placement to be safe. Also, maybe dungeon layouts, because what is this? So all of the towns have various points of views going on, mostly isometric, but each of the combat zones take place on a 2D plane, many of its exits going north or south. That means it's very likely that you're gonna get lost, especially because there's no in-game maps. Now, 9-year-old me playing this when it came out was savvy enough to make physical maps and write it down for reference, but 31-year-old me is like, let's go to legendofmana.info. This will help, but also this right here, this is evil. At least every second I spent lost was filled with beautiful visuals and the incredible original soundtrack by Yoko Shimomura. Where do I go? Thankfully, you're not left completely alone. Legend of Mana's little vignettes do end up leading you through a couple of story arcs that, while aren't massive or have much impact on the main story, do leave an impression. As you play through creating this world, you'll eventually get the keys to start one of the 3 main quest arcs, each of which will lead you to the end of the game. Looking at speedruns, that means it's possible to reach the end of the game in under 15 events in less than 2 hours. Considering it has over 60 events, all of which work together to create and shape this world, I think it's fair to say that you shouldn't do that. But that really lends credence to the fact that they wanted you to take your time, that they wanted you to talk to every NPC and find out the lore behind each of the game's many races. They wanted you to take your time in each of the major cities you create, looking through each nook and cranny in order to find something that sticks. If I could compare Legend of Mana to my favorite anime of all time, it would be Kino's Journey. The old one, not the 3D motorcycle. It's a story about a traveler named Kino going to distant lands, learning about the culture, meeting various people, finding out more about their squabbles and conflicts, sometimes finding themselves in the middle of it all. And sometimes the events have little to no effect on both the land, the people, and Kino. Legend is basically a video game version of that show, except you're the traveler who ends up climbing a tower with a princess and attempting to stop a jewel thief. You're the traveler attempting to solve the mystery of a ghost appearing. You're the traveler who just kind of ends up being at the right or wrong place at the right or wrong time. And these stories will sometimes interject with each other. At some point, you'll meet an NPC named Rubens, who, by the way, has that Randy hairstyle going on, and he has a heavy part in the mystery quest and the Jumi story arc. The Jumi are a people who, while humanoid, have their heart basically exposed on the outside of their bodies as jewels. They're being hunted by other races due to these gemstones being highly coveted and valuable. At some point early on, Rubens is killed in this exact manner, and later is found in a completely different story arc. At some point, your character ends up dying and being sent down to the underworld in order to help a dragon god, and he's just sitting there like, what up, it's your boy. I remember life, that was cool. This and countless other examples of world building set Legend of Mana a standard higher than other JRPGs of its ilk, especially at the time. In the 2020s, we expect our RPGs to be filled with a ridiculous amount of additional content and story to experience. Some writer definitely made sure to explain the exact importance of some tiny village's agricultural output and how it impacts the main city. Legend doesn't necessarily over-explain, but it shows a lot. It takes the approach of not only letting you take your time and force you to explore, but also makes you literally create the world piece by piece. This weird, open-ended approach to an RPG begins to make sense near the end though, as the narrative kind of relies on self-discovery. The player character, like it or not, ends up becoming important to the world. You get the ability to hear the mana tree, and eventually you find an artifact that brings it into prominence once again, only to find out that it's been rotting. It's no longer being abused by a central evil villain, but is instead dying due to mankind moving on, and it's trying to communicate with the player to help it get cleansed. The text in the game says it's rotting with evil, and that's not explored too much. I kind of just assumed it was a metaphor for neglect, or the slow agnosticism of a planet towards what was once important. But despite this end-of-the-world scenario, the ending moments of Legend of Mana aren't really what make it. Sure, you end up fighting a giant boss and saving the world, and it's kind of cliche, but Legend really is about the journey. It's about helping Nicolo out with his schemes. It's about Diddle and Capella trying to busk their way to stardom with their weird circus music act, while also having their own internal conflicts and doubts, even if the translations are a bit weird. It's like Kino's Journey, about getting wrapped up in something greater than yourself, even if it's a lot more than you asked for. This sense of adventure is really what makes Legend of Mana for me. However, a lot may call it a weakness, considering in a traditional narrative you want strong and relatable characters to provide the lens on which you view the story. But on the flip side, there's something uniquely awesome about just throwing a world at the player. It tosses beautiful pieces of art, it creates a symphonic wall of great sounding midis, and just leaves like 80% up to the imagination. It's an experimental approach you only really see with indies these days, for better or worse. Can you imagine booting up a modern AAA game that instead of letting you get in a boat and just go up and down, makes you talk to the helmsman who will say certain lines based on your position on the sea chart, certain lines that may or may not activate quests? Yeah, no.
If I had any gripes or problems with Legend, it's really just a sign of the times. The quality of life just really wasn't there back then. The PlayStation 1 era jankiness just kind of brings the experience down a peg, just a little bit.
There's not much in the manner of quest tracking here, so it's very likely that if you take a break, you'll come back and be lost as to what step of whatever quest you're on. You get the name and a brief sentence, but other than that, it's up to you. Then it'll be like, find this person in this dungeon, but then the map looks like this, so it's like, there. Also, sometimes the sound effects are a lot. The biggest issue for me probably was the fact that so much of the game's content is missable or easily failable. Quests don't get a do-over, so if you're unsure about what just happened, you'll end up reloading save files over and over. For example, I'm looking for treasure, it gets ripped up, and I'm supposed to repair this map by catching the dead bears who speak a rather beautiful tongue, I might add. And the only way to catch them is to stop in your tracks and hit confirm when they run into you. However, there's an invisible timer that will cause you to fail and be kicked out to the main map with your captain saying, "We can try again another time," despite that being a bold-faced lie. You might also accidentally reject a quest or completely fail a step by bringing a character into a certain place. I like to recruit NPCs to help me with combat because just running around with a pet is awful, but I brought Niccolo to some boys in this shop and he was like, "Oh, okay, I guess I'm going to jail now," ending his multi-part quest line and hitting an impassable fail state. Nice. See, this is why I said you should use a walkthrough. It's basically required. Other than that, there's only the rare occasional bit of jank, like when your party needs to auto-run up on something with your pet's a zombie and the run speed is very, very fast. But all in all, Legend of Mana is one of those games that I do like and I think will go down with a lot of respect. From a distance. Despite it being available on the PlayStation 3 digital store and soon on everything with the remaster, Legend continues to be seemingly the black sheep, the turning point, and according to a lot of people, the last good Seiken Densetsu game. Well, I mean, Trials Remake was good, but that doesn't count. Thankfully, it sold pretty well in Japan and even got itself a manga series for some reason. One where the main characters actually have names, and the boy, Todo, is obsessed with Quistis from Final Fantasy VIII? And that's what you call synergy. It's actually the first work by Shiro Amano, the guy who went on to do all of the Kingdom Hearts manga adaptations. It doesn't really capture the spirit of the game considering it reads like a random shonen from the 2000s, but hey, at least they tried. So all of this leaves Legend of Mana in a very peculiar position. It's a game that was promoted by and merchandised by Squaresoft when it came out, but it failed to capture the sales Secret of Mana did in the States. It was also the last original title to come out in the series before it got rebooted with the World of Mana collection that most view as a failure. It's also the newest game in the franchise as of this writing due to the remake. It's also the only game being remade that's been left largely untouched. Not that anyone could really improve on this incredible sprite artwork, but we're left with hopefully the definitive edition of a game that is frankly weird as hell, but also something that's one of a kind and worth your time.
And well, that's Squaresoft's Legend of Mana, a game that in my opinion isn't just the black sheep for the Mana franchise, but also Square as a whole. They loved experimenting in the PlayStation 1 days, like, a lot, but I don't think any of those games needed a walkthrough just to, like, understand. I'm excited for the re-release just because I want to see if they do any of these quality of life changes, if they do add a mini-map or stuff like that, because a little change like that could make it a legit 9 out of 10 game. And if not, it'll always be fun to see a whole new generation suffer. Just remember that if you ever think Legend of Mana is cryptic or confusing to navigate, that the director went on to also do Final Fantasy XI, the game where you can actually level down if you die. Although that's not as hard as making an account. Play online sucks. I'll catch you guys next time when I dive deep into a game that everyone kind of sees as a punching bag, but I kind of like.
Thank you all so much for watching. Special Patreon shout out to Brandon Howell, Chris Shelton, Christopher Olivia, D.A. Stevens, Darren Newton, Donnan, DX Buster, David Molnar, Eli Shane Staufenecker, GM Pinks, Jay Roos, Jacoby Fitzpatrick, Jordy McCaffrey, Kevin Zanowski, Karen Arter, Legend Gary, Nick Irving, P-Funk, Ryan Talbert, and Zach Porter. Thank you all so much for your generous support. This one took me a bit, but I hope it was worth it. I put a lot of time and energy into it, and I'm going to be doing more stuff like this in the future. Said this on Twitter, but we're going to be more posy vibes this year. It's going to be good. All right, you guys have a good day. I love you. Goodbye.